Good afternoon, everybody. If I could have your attention, please. Sorry to interrupt your conversations. Thank you very much. We're just going to now show a quick video that's direct from Glasgow. As you know, with the Conference of Parties going on there, our friends at the Rockefeller Foundation made kind of a on-the-ground video for us that's just 2.5 minutes long, and then I'll introduce the panel, and half of our panel will be in Glasgow. Thanks.
Climate change is hugely consequential for national security and politics.
It will become a new world security issue if we do not address right now. Islands and least developed countries will be significantly impacted by climate change.
If we cannot make a good deal in this COP26, more and more climate refugees will appear like Tuvalu. My name is Vincent J.F. Huang. I'm a Taiwanese artist. I use through my art practice to help Tuvalu to show their climate crisis since 2010. I always use polar bear and penguin to metaphor the situation in Tuvalu because Tuvalu is standing on the climate frontier now.
We saw about 5 years ago refugees leaving Syria and also Africa going to Europe created a huge amount of political change and some instability even in Europe. And that was a trickle compared to the flows of migration that we could see with climate change. My name is Ben Strauss. I'm a CEO and Chief Scientist of Climate Central. We're trying to show the picture to the world of what the future is if we're ambitious versus not. And we can do that in a simple picture. Here's Shanghai, St. Petersburg, the world's tallest building in Dubai with its toes in the water. If we go to the 3 degrees Celsius on the right, 1.5 degrees Celsius on the left.
This is very interesting. So expanded the remit a little bit.
And we'll see a rise in the sea level rise, and islands will disappear, nations will disappear, cultures will disappear. And this would be a big catastrophe for humanity. I am Shamila Nair-Bedouel, the Assistant Director General for Natural Sciences in UNESCO. We need to protect from source to sea, and this has a rollerball effect on communications, populations, countries, and the planet.
Great, thanks for that. And now, sorry. Just one sec for our speakers coming in from Glasgow. I will introduce our panelists here first. First, I'll introduce the moderator, Jim Shuto from CNN, the chief.
The Assistant Director General for Natural Sciences in UNESCO. We need to protect from source to sea, and this has a rollerball effect please. On communications, populations, countries, and the planet.
Our team is working hard. Our panelists are expected to dance soon. No. But we have the mayor. We have the mayor. First, I'll introduce the moderator, Jim Shuto from CNN, the chief.
The Assistant Director General for Natural Sciences in UNESCO. We need to protect from source to sea. And this
okay, they're working on it. I tell you what, why don't we get started here? I will turn it over to Jim, but let me first introduce, we have just arrived. Welcome, Mayor Gloria of San Diego. We're delighted to have you. And Dan Poneman, who's the former Deputy Secretary of Energy and now is at Centris Energy. So we'll get started, and I will give you a nod, Jim, and we've got our friends in from Glasgow.
Fantastic.
Thanks
so much. Heck, it's just like a pandemic television show, right? You got people coming in via Zoom from all over the world. Sometimes it doesn't work. Most of the time it does. Anyway, it's great to be here with the Aspen Institute. Only downside is we're not in Aspen, but next summer, let's hope we're back. Appreciate all of you joining, and great to share the stage with Mayor Gloria and Dan. And we look forward to be joining from Glasgow with a whole host of luminaries, if all works out. I cover national security for CNN, which is quite a broad portfolio, but it's been interesting to me how climate change has overlapped and entered that portfolio more and more in recent years, very directly. I've often said to people, if they think that climate change is not real, just ask the US Navy, because the US Navy, it's right on their website. They talk about the threats very directly. They have for a number of years, and they're already doing their best to deal with it, right down to trying to find more sustainable ways to fuel their ships, right? To gas them up as they sail around the world. Then, of course, recently this highlighted with this new national intelligence estimate, which attempts to articulate a lot of these things in one place. I wanted to do, these are our guests, I think. This is Alice and Damilola from Glasgow. I wonder, do you think, Niev, that they hear me already? Because I just saw them pop up on the screen. Or I can wait until you... If they think
Hello? Hello?
just ask the US Navy, because the US Navy
Hello?
is right on their website. They talk about the threats very directly. They have for a number of years. Tell you what, while we line that up, because I did want to direct a question to them first, but while we wait, Dan and Todd have enormous experience here. Todd fighting this battle as the leader of a city, a coastal city, front lines of this, right? And Dan with long experience, including as Deputy Secretary of Energy. I wonder, Dan, just look, as we look to G20, their commitments to climate change, but also COP26 so far. And by the way, the NIE, part of the NIE is that COP26 is going to fail, notably, that the commitments just won't happen, do a whole host of things. On the positive side, what's the most positive development you've seen from Europe in the last several days?
I think the consensus that I think has been reified by the suite of analyses released by the White House, the National Intelligence Estimate, the strategic framework from the Department of Homeland Security, and the climate risk analysis by DoD have really pulled together a lot of the thinking that has been present across all nations. I think people now realize that but for this slight dip because of the pandemic, that global emissions have risen 60% since the IFCC in 1992, and they realize that this is a do or die moment. I think the collection of leaders who are there, regrettably a few of them, key leaders are not there, I think provides a once in a lifetime opportunity to start to move from good talk to concrete actions. And I think the consensus that you see reflected in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 1.5-degree report, the consistent reporting out of the International Energy Agency provide a real roadmap to get there, involving renewables, efficiency, reforestation, nuclear, and everything in the toolkit. And if we don't get the finance behind it, which I think is one of the important things we have to work on in Glasgow, you're going to just continue to see a drifting upward, and we're not going to get to net zero by 2050.
Yeah. Mayor Gloria, of course, there are lots of cleavages in terms of responding to this internationally between fossil-producing nations and consuming nations, between developing world and developed world. Of course, China will often make the point, listen, we're warm now because of all the stuff you spewed for the last 100-some-odd years, you know, we're less responsible, therefore. The one place where it's a bipartisan issue, it strikes me in the US, or particularly, is in coastal cities. You know, Florida is one of those states where a lot of Republicans talk about climate change because they know their toes are going to be in the water soon, right? I wonder, and San Diego, of course, in the same category, does that help this country, which has been sluggish in many ways in addressing this, to begin to address it seriously?
Yeah. Well, thanks for the question, and it's wonderful to be here and share the stage virtually and in person. I would say yes, and when answering the question you asked Secretary just a moment ago, you know, let's be mindful that a year ago, the American presence at COP would have been radically different. Everything President Biden said this week would have been the exact opposite. So that gives me some hope as someone who sees the urgency of this crisis. And the second positive thing was the number of mayors from around the world who are there making commitments. You know, we see these national, international proclamations. It is often cities that have to implement. And so when I see, as you mentioned, the mayor of Miami there speaking very eloquently and sincerely about the need to take action, as well as mayors from LA and other places that are saying, we will do this, that's precisely what I'm doing. It is not abstract. You mentioned the national security implications. In addition to being a border city, San Diego is a proud military town. You can go to any base in my city and you can see the actual real-time implications of what is happening and the fact that they are acting with urgency. Challenge is whether or not cities, nations, and the globe are doing the same. And as was mentioned, at least we're having this conversation and there's some effort to try and actually address this issue. But again, American leadership has to be present, and at least there was American leadership there for this summit.
We have our friends from Glasgow, I think, hearing us now. Alice Hill, Damilola, Ogunbiyi, make sure I have that pronounced correctly. Are you hearing Jim Shudo okay from DC? Fantastic. So, Alice, if I could begin with you, given your background at the White House in the Obama administration, including developing a policy to prepare for the catastrophic risks of climate change, biological threats as well, can you tell us how have discussions in Glasgow connected those two issues of climate change and national or international security?
It's been exciting here in Glasgow. For the first time ever, a COP, and of course we've had 26 now, is considering national security and climate change. We had an event yesterday. We heard from the head of NATO emphasizing the importance of looking at the national security risks. Of course, those risks include, as we've heard from the mayor, the risks to installations, but it also includes operational. Do our planes fly in very hot conditions? Some of them won't. So we need to plan for that. What do our procurement and acquisitions look like? And of course, there's the great risk of global instability as more and more populations face food insecurity, water insecurity, and that will mean they're on the move in unprecedented numbers, which is highly destabilizing for the communities that receive those climate migrants. And they're moving because they're hungry, because they need survival resources. And it's also hard for the communities that lose those individuals. So this is a very destabilizing time that we're headed into, and national security forces across the world are recognizing it's time to pay attention. So very exciting here.
Damilola, great to have you here, given your work with the UN Secretary General on this issue. As I noted before you came on to the panelists, Daniel and Todd, who we have here in DC, is that the US National Intelligence Estimate, really one of the first serious efforts to do a broad intel assessment of the national security risks from climate change, begins almost with the point, the prediction that COP26 will fail to bring nations together on concrete action, given the many divisions. I wonder if you think that's too pessimistic an assessment.
So yes, I do think it's pessimistic. I mean, we're already seeing some fundamental shifts, right? So the announcement from India was huge. What they are planning to do by 2070 and how they're trying to just basically change their economy to a 50% renewable economy and one of the largest economies in Asia is just really, really important for all the coal-based power plants that we know have to be phased out. The other thing is just from my country, Nigeria, very big oil and gas nation as well, committing to net zero by 2060, asking countries to actually help them in renewables. And it's very important when we talk about this issue with migration, which was a very good point. A lot of people are not leaving their countries because they don't like their countries. One of the major reasons why they're leaving their countries, which we never discuss in these forums, is the issue of energy poverty. And energy poverty is a real thing and affects about 1 billion people in the world currently now. So as much as we're talking about decarbonization, you still have a lot of people who don't have access to energy at all. That is a big, big risk. And again, one of the great things about COP was the announcement from the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet saying that we are going to focus on people and planet. We're going to focus on eradicating energy poverty, but we're also going to do it in a clean, transformational way. So there's a lot of things happening in the sidelines that might not be getting the big headlines. It's not so easy. In 2 weeks, you cannot fix climate change. It's not possible. But the key actions that you can drive when you're here, matching people, people meeting in person, and understanding the important role of this, and understanding the important role of the developing world. We hear so much about emerging economies and the developed world, but we forget how important it is for the developing countries to also be on board with the energy transition.
Yeah. Alice Hill, you mentioned, and Damilola mentioned a couple of the examples of where climate change issues lead to events and consequences which lead to security implications, refugees being among them. We talk about battles over water, battles over arable land, right, as that changes with climate, and the particular risk of islands and how that factors in. I wonder, when you look at the map today, are there particular flashpoints that you look at with particular concern in the coming years that these issues will boil over?
Absolutely. The impacts of climate change fall unevenly, and in some instances they fall very hard on the developing world, particularly countries that are already in conflict. So we're going to add these extra, very damaging impacts to populations that are struggling already to live in peace. We also have a number of shared river basins across the globe. About 200 of them have agreements, as to how to share the water between nations, but those agreements do not yet account for climate change in any way, and that will be a source of tension going forward. We'll also see, unfortunately, some areas in the tropics, in the Middle East, that will experience so much heat that it's unbearable to be outside because of the wet bulb temperature. We simply can't perspire enough in very humid conditions to stay alive. So people from those areas that can afford to go will be going, and they will be on the move. We saw I believe in Iraq, 165 degrees Fahrenheit reached this summer. Of course, our meteorologic services are telling us that we are in unprecedented heat right now, and this will probably be among the cooler years that we're experiencing right now as we move forward. So lots of impacts, but particularly hitting the developing world. They don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the wealth to contend with these impacts the way the developed world can.
Damilola, can I ask you a difficult question? Or I will, but with apologies. I was in Rome for the G20, and one thing I've heard, and I'm sure I'm not the only person in the room who has, in private conversations with European diplomats, including from our closest allies, and by the way, this is not all private, you've heard some of this in public, but particularly in private, are doubts about America's ability to lead credibly on this, in part because any promise made today might be reversed in a couple of years when the parties in power change. And we saw that with the Paris Climate Accords. Of course, Obama was in, Trump was out, Biden is back in. Who knows what happens post-2024? And the same might be said with the difficulty of getting climate legislation passed as part of the broader budget bill here in the US, to shore up whatever America is saying while it's in Scotland. Are you confident in America's ability to lead on this issue? And not just lead, but take part, right? Because we're one of the biggest emitters. This in public, but particularly private.
Well, look, this question about the United States flipping and flopping isn't a new one. You'll recall that George Bush pulled out of the Kyoto protocols, then we had President Trump. So it is the most common question I receive from our allies. How can we trust the United States? The Biden team is doing, in my opinion, a phenomenal job of signaling that we're in. We have something like a baker's dozen of cabinet secretaries present here. Every day there's a new announcement. The Global Methane Pledge yesterday, led by EU and the US. Now over 100 nations. Of course, methane gas is incredibly damaging in the short term in terms of heating. Pledge to do more there. The deforestation pledge, an adaptation plan, a long-term strategy. So, of course, the Biden administration is working extremely hard to signal we're in. The thing that will help the Biden administration is that it hurts the rest of us. Climate change is here. This is a political issue that will tag every team, and it will be the question of how we're going to address it. If we have our national security forces across the globe worried about climate change, any political party needs to be worried as well. So it's a hard question, but I think the Biden team is working extremely hard to answer it, and I believe to some extent has already answered it, that the U.S. is back and will remain in.
Damilola, do you agree? Do you hear the same from other member nations in the UN, for instance, that they're taking the U.S. at its word?
Definitely. I mean, everyone was skeptical at the beginning of the administration, but just the thought, I mean, you're not here, but you feel the energy of the U.S. John Kerry's here, the agency heads are here. At the UN General Assembly, the U.S. provided an energy compact for the first time, where they emphasized with all the U.S. agencies, including initiatives like Power Africa, what they are going to do, not just in line with Paris, but in line with the 2030 targets. And that's what shows seriousness, not just focusing on the long term, but what has to happen within the U.S. and how they're going to support the global south by 2030. So we're very, very encouraged, and at the UN we will hold the U.S. to their word. But all signs now just shows that we are moving in the right direction.
I'm going to come back to our DC participants for a moment here. Daniel, you have the advantage of having served under administrations of both parties and through a long period of time, going back to H.W. Bush, but Clinton, Obama, it's almost 20 years of watching two parties deal with, or not deal with, frankly, climate challenges. As you look at that timeline, do you see genuine, concrete, positive progress in terms of taking it more seriously, but also doing something about it?
I would say yes. Beneath the very fundamental rhetorical differences, if you look at the actual practice, for example, of the U.S. Department of Energy, you do find a lot of consistency over the years. You'll find, for example, just as during the Obama administration they were talking about an all-of-the-above energy strategy, so too that was what was being said at the Abu Dhabi forum by Secretary Briette a few years ago, and they've made the investments. You know, the solar prices have come down phenomenally. The loan guarantee programs that were launched in the Obama administration have continued and have triggered a lot of private sector investment. And I would have to say the one place where you've seen, I think, more than any other sector, some convergence is on nuclear energy. You've had not just at the White House end of the Pennsylvania Avenue, but in the Congress, two very powerful bipartisan bills passed because of the recognition that nuclear energy is fundamental to any successful long-term climate strategy. You've got a $3.2 billion investment with a 50-50 cost share that the administration, the Biden administration has embraced, was started during the Trump administration. And under that, you're going to have innovative reactors by people like Bill Gates, TerraPower, and X-Energy. In a few years, they're going to be actually deploying that kind of energy. That's critical because there's a national security linkage that goes right back to the fundamental premise of the Aspen Strategy Group and Joe Nyan, our late founder, Brent Scowcroft, which is the intimate nexus between nuclear energy and national security. And the question is, if we need nuclear energy to get to net zero, can we do that and not inadvertently trigger some kind of nuclear conflict, because the same technology, obviously, that can drive turbines and generate steam can also drive a nuclear weapon.
Yes. Mayor Gloria, it's a political issue by its nature, right? Because folks got to elect people who are willing to tackle these kinds of issues. They have to be willing to pay taxes, to pay for initiatives, right? And elect people who are proposing such taxes, but also as consumers, they got to want to do it, right? Throw the solar panels up on the roof of their house or something, you know, regardless of what the incentives is. We saw in the elections last night, how much bread and butter issues drive things. Just a reminder, it always has, right? But inflation drives people, you know, jobs drive people, you know, that sort of thing. In your experience as a politician who has to win elections, is climate change transitioning to a bread and butter issue when people see their houses burned down, right? I mean, you know, you have no more granular experience of it, or your house flood, right, at the other end of the extreme. Is that happening? Or is it still a conscientious issue as opposed to a bread and butter one?
So don't let the Botox fool you. I've been in this game a long time, and I will tell you that I've noticed the evolution to more of a bread and butter issue, in the sense that, you know, in San Diego, and I take no pride in saying this, we have extremely high water rates and extremely high energy rates. What have we gotten for that? Well, you haven't seen a major wildfire in the San Diego County area since 2007. We have fires, don't get me wrong, but the investments we made in our electrical infrastructure to prevent the kind of widespread fire, that has come at a significant cost of ratepayers, but the alternative of not having your house burned down has made that worthwhile. Same is true for water. We are pouring billions into water reliability such that we have an abundance of water in my jurisdiction. Now, that has not been cost-free. It has been reflected in the rates that people in San Diego pay every single month. But again, we're not under mandatory water restrictions. So I think we're starting to draw a line from, yes, it's painful, but the opposite, the status quo is more painful and more costly, right? So how do we go to vehicles? And this is harder, right? We are looking at a number of interventions to try and transition people into different forms of transportation. Those are not exactly wildly popular at the moment. But what we do have is a bare majority of folks supporting it. And my belief is that if we continue to message and show leadership, we can get there. Hopefully it's done for positive, proactive, initiative leading reasons, as opposed to a reaction to something like out of control gas prices and the things that may have been seen in recent elections. Point is that we can't stick our head in the sand. And when we've made smart investments at some substantial cost, we have seen the benefits in having water reliability and energy security and a lack of the kind of wildfires that we've seen in our partners in Northern California.
I mean, it feels like every day it's a new record. we have them in our broadcast. This one is bigger than 10 records in 1 year. I want to take a moment to thank our participants from Glasgow, Alice Hill, Ogunbiyi. Thanks so much for joining us from over there. It's great to get a view from the ground. You'll have to report back in a week or two when it's all done to see if to see what the bottom line was on COP26.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Soon we're going to be joined by Shah, the Rockefeller Foundation. But while we wait for him, Daniel, when you heard pronouncements of confidence in U.S. leadership on this, do you have the same confidence? I mean, I'll be honest, I haven't heard that when I've spoken to diplomats from a lot of countries.
I think we have to. I'm still affiliated with the Belfer Center. My latest study is going to be called, and they said it couldn't be done. When you think of the times in history that the United States have been counted down and out, and we've come back, places where we've established leadership, lost it, and regained it, it's a good story. It's microchips. Remember in the 1980s, everyone thought Japan was going to take over the industry. We surged back. We lost our ability to get to space with domestic space launch. Now we have SpaceX. So when we put our minds to something, we can do great things. And I do believe that we are seeing some convergence around this climate change proposition to the degree that people will potentially rally, but it's going to take leadership.
Speaking of leadership, Shah, if you can hear Jim Sciutto from DC, there you are. Nice to have you on.
Thank you, Jim. Nice to be with you. And hi, everybody, back home.
I wonder if I could rely on you to be our field reporter from Glasgow now to report for a moment on what progress you're seeing, if any, on the key issues.
Well, you're about to get a much more qualified field reporter come in here in just a few seconds, so I'm happy to try to be filler for you. Look, it's sort of what you'd expect. I mean, the challenge is enormous. I think everyone recognizes this meeting matters tremendously. I think folks are pretty clear-eyed about where the gaps are. The global fight against climate change has not really been one that has been fully inclusive of emerging and developing economies, and the actions have not been there to follow the targets and the words. And that's why leaders like Secretary Kerry, who's joining in a moment, and so many others here have been scrambling to use this as a forcing function to get things to happen. And I just want to validate what Damilola said a few minutes ago. I think in the margins, there are some amazing new efforts and initiatives that are making a real difference. We had a chance to launch one yesterday, the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, that has brought together $10 billion of resources, including from 3 major philanthropies, ourselves, the IKEA Foundation, and the Bezos Earth Fund, but also from banks, multilateral development banks and development finance institutions, to really in a concrete way both address and accelerate the energy transition and expand access to people who don't have energy. And the reality is this big, grand global project to fight climate change is simply not going to be successful if it doesn't fundamentally include everyone's hopes, dreams, and aspirations. And we believe this, this initiative is one way to make it more inclusive.
Is there I think this may be our special guest. I don't know if this is a surprise. Is it a surprise, Neve? It's a surprise. The man about to sit down, if I'm not going to steal all his thunder, is the U.S. Climate Envoy, John Kerry, who's going to join us. I imagine they're miking him up there. And there he is, Secretary Kerry.
With you already, yep.
You see me?
I can see you well. Can you hear me okay from D.C.?
We hear you terrifically. We hear you too well.
Fantastic. I will bring my Italian-Irish baritone down a skosh to so
No,
don't
love it. It's great. Thanks.
I don't pop your eardrums. Listen, thank you so much. I mean, listen, it's a tremendous opportunity for me to be able to speak to you, but we have an audience here that has perked up with your presence. I wonder if I could begin by asking what your expectations are for takeaways, deliverables from COP26, because your comments in the last day downplaying expectations to some degree, saying that COP26 is not the definitive one meeting on climate progress versus a couple of weeks ago when you described it as a lot have, as the last best hope given the time pressure here. Why that change? Why that further managing of expectations?
There's no change, and I'm not managing expectations. It is the last best hope to pull together the finance, the ambition, and the reality of achieving what we need to achieve over the next 10 years. But everybody who's been involved in this knows that this was defined by the scientists in the IPCC report of 2018 as a 12-year period during which we had to make and implement the key decisions to avoid the worst consequences of the climate crisis. We lost 3 years with President Trump, who pulled out of the agreement. So now we are back. We are racing forward. And we all know that there's going to be a gap. There isn't anybody who's serious who approached this who believed every country was going to come in with a complete and total 100% guarantee on 1.5 degrees. But I'll tell you what we do have, which nobody would have predicted a few months ago. The entire G20 signed off on saying no finance of coal externally in any country in the world as of the end of this year. And every country in the G20 signed on to 1.5 degrees. That was a point of contention a few months ago. So now we're sitting in a position where finance targets are being announced. We have the greatest private sector participation that I've seen, and I have seen COPs since the very first. This is number 26. I was in Rio, 92, when we created the framework that ultimately, empowers all of these UN meetings every year. And so we now know that we have 65% of global GDP has raised their ante and are committed to try to hold to the 1.5 degrees temperature in the next 10-year time period. So 2020 to 2030, which we always said is the decisive decade, we always pointed to the decade of action that was necessary. And if we don't reduce enough in the course of the next 10 years, then 1.5 is blown and we can't achieve net zero by 2050. Those are the stakes. They don't get higher.
Yep.
But Canada, Japan, South Korea, the US, UK, EU, South Africa, and have all signed on to real plans that have been certified by all the observers that if they do them, if they fully implement them, can keep the hope of 1.5 degrees alive. And we will know over the course of the next days sort of where the new NDCs come out. That's the national contributions of individual countries. But I feel that, look, there's greater energy, greater focus, greater sense of urgency, greater participation by the private sector than we've ever seen here. And in the first 36 hours of this COP, more has been announced than I ever heard announced at other COPs. You know, $9 billion from President Biden to deal with forest deforestation, $12 billion from the EU and Boris Johnson to deal with deforestation, major plans by corporations to the financiers of the world are committing literally trillions of dollars for investment in this sector. It's up to our countries that are involved and all of us and Raj and others to create the structures where we're dealing with the first risk and dealing with the blended finance and bringing people together to accelerate the deployment of those trillions, because they're not eleemosynary. They're not a giveaway. It's an investment. And so we have to get the cooperation of countries to make sure there can be a return on that investment, not exorbitant. We're not talking about Googles and Apples, but we are talking about a legitimate return that a CalPERS or pension fund somewhere else can actually invest and have a long-term return. That's the way we deliver on this, and I think we're in a place where what I predicted was that we'd have a huge increase in ambition, an increase in finance, and I think it's already beginning to exceed many people's expectations.
Has the U.S. been hampered there by the failure yet, at least, to pass its own significant commitment to the $550 billion in terms of emission reductions, largely tax incentives, et cetera, which are essential to meet its goal of having emissions by 2030? To not have that in place prior, has that hampered the U.S. position and credibility both in Rome but also in Glasgow?
No, actually it has not. I worried that it might, but in truth, it has not. I think people were thrilled with President Biden's presence here, with the commitments that he made, with the depths to which he made it clear that the United States is in this fight and in it to win. And we're going to help other nations. We have a program called Prepare, which is the President's emergency program for adaptation and resilience to help less developed countries in the world. He's raised the amount of money contributed to that six-fold higher than it was. Similarly for adaptation funding. So people have seen a president and a country, the United States, that is offering leadership, not insisting on it, but offering it and working with other countries to make great things happen here. And when you add that to I've never heard deforestation as significantly on the table. It's not that people didn't mention it, but now it's a big priority. I met today with the president of the Democratic Republic of Congo, President Tshisekedi. We talked about the ways in which he can harness new alternative renewable power and protect the Congo Basin, which is such a huge element. It's like the Amazon in terms of being the lungs of the earth, the three great basins. The other is in Southeast Asia. And there we have increased effort by Indonesia to step up and do significant things. So look, Jim, none of this is done just because people say it here. But I'll tell you, it's never going to get done if they don't say it here. Yeah. And now that we are, the next step will be to come, and it's not over. We have another 10 days of negotiations, a lot more give and take. But I hope we will have a COP that can bring people together in an unprecedented fashion. And then the key is we have to implement. We have to meet within hours of leaving here and sit down together, the private sector, the public sector, the charitable philanthropies, and come together and say, okay, implementation time. And we set up a schedule, and we do everything that we have empowered ourselves to do by being here in Glasgow. And I think it's an exciting time. This entire transition portends extraordinary positive transformation for us. And it will provide an America and a world which, if we do it, is cleaner, safer, healthier, and we will be stepping up and exercising the responsibility that citizens around the world are asking us to exercise.
We've been talking today about the overlap between national or international security interests and challenges and climate change and just how intertwined they are today. As you know, there's a new national intelligence estimate which speaks about much of that overlap, but it also cites a particular obstacle to progress, and that is resistance from fossil fuel producing countries. And the NIE sees that cleavage as continuing. I wonder, do you see any movement from the Saudi Arabias of the world, Russia as well, which is notably not where you are, to that resistance?
The answer is yes. I visited Saudi Arabia about a week ago for their major announcement, which we've been talking with them about for months, which raises their NDC to accepting net zero by 2050, but most importantly, deploying 50% of their new power will be alternative and renewable in that period. And Saudi Arabia has a plan to deploy a massive solar field up in the northern part on the western coast near Neom, this new city that the Crown Prince is building. And that solar field will be used to power the electrolyzers that will make green hydrogen. And they do have existing infrastructure, some of which can be used, but they're prepared. And Italy and Greece are both very interested in being transit areas for the piping of green hydrogen to Europe, and ultimately, obviously, it'll also go to Africa. So it remains for us still. We have big things we have to finish here. We have to get green hydrogen fully at scale and get the next generation of electrolyzers and move this forward. We have to get direct air capture of carbon. That's one of the big goals. We still aren't there. We have to do that. We have to get long-term storage capacity. If we keep pushing the curve the way we are with countries like Saudi Arabia, I'm excited about the possibilities of getting there. We are going to work with Saudi Arabia on the deployment. We agreed to be partners sort of in this green hydrogen effort. And I think we can bring a lot to the table. And already there's an American company, Air Products, involved in this. Aqua, another company on the ground, involved in this. So it's real. Now, there are other countries that have stepped up in these last months. Russia never contemplated talking about when it would be carbon neutral or net zero. And we're working with the Russian team. We've had meetings. We've been there. I've talked to President Putin. I know he's serious about the consequences. He's an extractive economy. So it's very hard for Russia just automatically overnight to turn around and say, oh, okay, we're not doing that, but we're going to do. It doesn't work that way. There has to be a transition. And they have a challenge in the northern part of their country where Siberia was burning with remarkable numbers of fires. Their infrastructure in the north is to some degree physically challenged by the permafrost thawing. Yep. And so there's an instability in some of it. And they know this in Russia. So they're seized by the issue, like lots of other countries that kind of thought, it's off in the future, we can push this off. But Mother Nature has made it clear, you can't push me off. Yeah. And she's rebelling and telling us, in the fires, in the floods, in the droughts, in the extreme heat, we lose about 5 million people a year on the planet to extreme heat. We lose 10 million people a year to the pollution. That's what we're talking about. This is pollution. So I think there's this right. And one other thing to your point. I just sat today with Bill Gates and Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber, who is the UAE Special Envoy on Climate, as I am. And we have worked with UAE. We're the first ever Middle East dialogue with 5 oil producers at that dialogue, signing on to the urgency of dealing with the climate crisis. And so all over the world, I think we're seeing leaders who now recognize the science and the urgency. Doesn't mean they're all signing on to the full measure of what we need to do. If we have 65% of global GDP committed to the 1.5, that means obviously we have 35% that isn't yet there. And the 65% cannot get there unless the others join up and are part of this process. So that's where the effort lies in the next 10 days here, to see if we can bring more people aboard. We had 105 nations yesterday sign on to a global methane pledge that we will reduce methane leakage, flaring, emissions that we can achieve at very low cost. It's not a complicated technological thing to do. And if we do that, that's saving 0.2 degrees of warming of the Earth's temperature. And methane is 20 to 80 times more destructive than CO2. So this is a big deal that 105 countries, President Biden announced this in New York in September at the General Assembly, and within the last days and weeks, we have found 105 countries taking this seriously enough to sign on. So something's happening. And my hope is that by the end of this COP, it's the greatest commitment of ambition we ever could have imagined, and that we are moving forward realistically to get the job done over the course of this decade. And that particularly puts pressure on next year, and then this animal, this creature of the UN process, which is called the stock take, which is actually taking stock in year 2023. But one other thing. We have a level of scrutiny now, of transparency and accountability we never had previously. We had little inklings of it. But now we have several satellite systems that will measure every day, any hour, methane or CO2. And so the old saying, you can run but you can't hide, that is now true of people who think they're going to be able to emit and nobody will know. Yep. Any supply chain of any big corporation will be able to measure. Any government that says it's doing X, Y, or Z, we will be able to measure. And the internet will light up, believe me, with the transgressors being held to account and publicly shamed and held to account. So this is getting real, far more real than it's been for a lot of people.
That's remarkable. I understand your team is drawing you back to the work at hand in Glasgow, but we do appreciate you joining us. We appreciate the update, and we'll be following your movements, decisions, announcements in the coming days to see where it all ends up. Thank you,
Jim. We call it in the product, it's called getting the hook.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Really appreciate it. Yeah.
Did we lose Raj then? Okay. I do, before he, there he is. Raj is back. Raj, I'm going to throw you a question I was going to throw Secretary Kerry, if you'll take it. China was not there, right? China's the biggest emitter. China's adding coal capacity, right? Coal-fired plants. It's not subtracting them. What consequence is there from that, and how much of a loss is that?
Well, look, I think you're right. China's not here. Actually, Secretary Kerry, as you know, has been engaging with China very closely at all kinds of levels of engagement over the last many months, and with representatives who are here. But the reality is, China's not just expanding, of course, fossil fuel-based electrification and energy in China. It has also, over the course of recent years, been the primary source of design, development, financing, and subsidy for 112 gigawatts of new coal in the Belt Road Initiative countries. And so the recent Chinese announcement to commit to greening the Belt and Road and ceasing to establish new coal beyond that has actually sent a fairly strong signal to emerging and developing economies that that train is no longer moving full steam ahead. It's a pretty modest step forward, because the 112 are still in the works. They are being designed, they're being financed, and they're being built as we speak, as part of a larger reality that the world is bringing online 1,000 new coal plants even as we have this meeting. But those are the points of progress. And those points of progress make a difference. And I'll tell you, people ask about sort of American presence and American leadership. As we've set up the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, which is a very significant multilateral collaboration, we've probably met with 30 countries where we intend to do and are already operational and doing work to accelerate the energy transition. Almost every one of those meetings starts with, well, I heard President Biden say this, or we just met with Secretary Kerry and he said that. And so the American presence here, and it really does, even for an unofficial, you know, we're the Rockefeller Foundation, a nonprofit institution in civil society, it opens doors and it creates possibilities that simply wouldn't be possible if we weren't being so active and so aggressive about pushing the agenda forward as a nation.
Well, Raj, Shah, and I believe I see Alice Hill joined again. Thanks so much to you for joining us from afar. We know you got lots of work to do, as does Secretary Kerry. So good luck. Godspeed.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
For a moment back here, and we are over time, but I do want to give Todd and Daniel just a final word. I'm a accentuate the positive guy. It's easy to say, they're not going to get anything done. Look at all the obstacles, et cetera. But you heard a fair amount of optimism there. From your seat, perhaps you first, Todd, and then Daniel. What's the most positive development you're expecting from COP26?
Well, I think the Secretary did a great job of laying out what's already occurred, and there's still many more days left to go. You know, forgive me for having a preference for localism and recognizing that a lot of those commitments are going to be executed by municipalities all around the globe. And I think about what's going on in San Diego, where in 2015 we committed to running on 100% renewable energy by 2035, something that was actually criticized at the time as being overly ambitious. And then fast forward a number of years later, you have cities, states, nations making similar commitments. We just last week announced our plan to go to net zero emissions by 2035. I imagine something that still seems ambitious, but 5 or 6 years from now will maybe seem less so. My point is that your question before about the changes in administration and what consistency is there, the consistency, the connective tissue across these administrations is often on a subnational level, and you're going to continue to see Republican and Democratic and independent mayors continuing to drive this agenda for trying to save the planet. Watch the cities, watch what we're doing, and understand that what we're doing is going to bubble up to the national and international level.
Daniel, I was talking to a friend who just joined the EPA a long time at Duke's environmental program, and he made the point to me that and I don't know the specifics well enough, so if I butcher them, anybody in the audience can tell me so, but that commitments that the Obama administration made on emissions, that we've actually already exceeded them as a country on a lot of levels. So listen, sometimes the positive stuff comes and you almost don't know, particularly in an environment of, we're not going to get anything done. But as you look out east, what is the most positive development you expect from COP26?
I'd summarize it, Jim, in 2 words: momentum and convergence. And you heard a lot of it from Secretary Kerry. If governments put all of their capital to work, it's not enough. But governments can make the seed investments that leverage private investment that was phenomenally successful. We didn't have a single solar PV utility scale plant in the United States in 2009. Under the Recovery Act, we financed 5, and every one since then has been financed by Wall Street. When the government invests, it lowers the risk, it lowers the cost of capital. We now need to replicate that. This latest set of studies, that of the White House, take the one from the Pentagon. The Pentagon has more space on roof than anybody else. They can create, through purchasing power, new markets that then the private sector can come in on. If that can be replicated on the international scale through the international finance institutions and the export credit agencies, we've got a chance. When he says that people like Bill Gates are getting together with the president of Indonesia, et cetera, that's what has to happen, and that's what gives me some reason for hope.
We'll have to watch the top of the Pentagon as we fly out of National to see if those solar panels go up. Well, thanks to Daniel and Todd. Certainly thanks to Secretary Kerry and Raj and Alice and Damilola, I want to get that right, from Glasgow. And thanks so much to all of you for joining. Sorry we went over a little bit, but you give a little allowance for the Chief Climate Envoy. But thanks very much, and thanks to you.